Welcome back to Alizoid. The following video provides an inside look of the final 24 hours of an inmate's life who is sentenced to death row. Viewer discretion is advised. There are currently over 3,000 inmates carrying out death row sentences in the United States of America. This number is said to change quite frequently, given that prisoners will be executed and others might join them. These are criminals that judges and juries have determined should be put to death for their crimes. But let's first look at the statistics. On death row right now, only 2% of inmates are women, 42% are classified as Caucasian males, and 41% as African Americans, with the remainder being described as in the minority. Death row sentences can take a total of 20 years. From the time of conviction to the execution chamber. That's a lot of time for reflection on your misdeeds. But now we are about to witness the events leading up to the final day of execution. Death row, otherwise known as capital punishment, is a legal penalty administered to criminals who have committed some of the most despicable and horrendous crimes. But, unlike medieval punishments, the procedure in which an inmate carries out the sentencing of death row has been altered over the years. At 8 p.m. sharp, the inmate is taken from his death row enclosure to a special section of the prison. This involves a drive from the prison to a building known as the House of Death. It is here in which he will spend his final hours in a new solitary enclosure. Prior to leaving death row, and before transit to the House of Death, the inmate is searched thoroughly. However, this is done not only to ensure the safety of the guards, but also to prevent the prisoner from committing suicide before his sentence is carried out. Tensions are usually high during these events, and extra precautions are taken to ensure the safe transit of the inmate. The atmosphere in the van is completely solemn, and guards are usually required to wear masks in order to protect their identities. Once the prisoner makes his entrance into the House of Death, he will never see the light of day again. The time is now 9 p.m. and the prisoner has been successfully checked into the House of Death. We're told that during this time, a death watch is implemented, and the prisoner is monitored at all times in the possible event that he attempts to take his own life. The cell is usually near to the execution chamber, and is a very private and secluded area. It is a place in which the inmate can reflect on his life, as the hour of his death gets closer. Prisoners will also be given special clothes, much different to their usual prison attire. These may be provided by the family, or close friends of the inmate. But, in most cases, it is much nicer than the usual prison jumpsuit. The prisoner can now sleep until he's awakened. But that is of course, if he can actually sleep. A diary of an inmate on death row was found, and it read, "I can finally feel a small, but fleeting sense of pride and happiness, to finally have a pair of trousers with a button and a zip." We don't know how well he slept. But in his diary, he mentions having to watch the guards slowly fall asleep whilst being on his death watch. He found this to be ironic and even a bit humorous, as a death watch guard is meant to watch the prisoner, not the other way around. The inmate is also observant of how much bigger the cell looks compared to his death row enclosure. The cell has a shower, toilet, bed, and even a desk with writing materials. The inmate also has access to a phone, in which he can provide a list of numbers he wishes to call. These are just a few commodities provided prior to the final hours of his sentence. The list usually consists of family members, or friends of the inmate. One by one, the guard would dial the number and allow the inmate to make his calls. This can be a very traumatic time for both the inmate and guards on duty. Each call comes to a very emotional ending, as this is the last time the prisoner would be able to make contact with those closest to him. Unfortunately, the guards can also grow to be impatient, as the inmate's time on the phone comes to an end. Upon making his final call, the only person left to speak with is the chaplain. It is now the chaplain's task to make the prisoner's final hours as comforting as possible. Whether it be writing a note or singing a song, or even simply listening to what the inmate had to say. Aside from the prison staff, the chaplain is the only person who is allowed to visit the prisoner if needed, especially in his final death chamber, and minutes before the sentence is carried out. The next morning, it is very likely that all of the execution equipment will be examined. If the form of execution is the chair, then the electrical components have to be tested. But if execution is by lethal injection, which it almost always is, the straps of the gurney must be working as well, even down to the smallest detail, like double-checking the phone. This may be used in the case of a last-minute reprieve, claiming that new evidence is discovered, and leads to the prisoner's innocence. The meals leading up to the final hour are not anything special. From what we can see, it is in fact the same old prison food that is served, except for maybe the very last meal. The only difference being that the prisoner gets to eat it in a private setting. In the death house kitchen, the chef will be preparing the final meal. Contrary to popular belief, inmates can't just order what they want. Which makes sense, as it is highly unlikely that authorities would be willing to spend a lot of money on an inmate's final meal, especially if tasked with acquiring some of the finest steaks in the country. For instance, the maximum this last meal can cost is $40. However, this changes according to your country or state. In some regional prisons, less fortunate convicts are subjected to a budget of only $15 for their last meal, which may just allow for a few slices of pizza. Evidently, this is hardly sufficient funds to host a lavish meal as your final dinner. As one death house chef noted, this meal is perhaps the only choice of food they would have had in 2 decades, so perhaps it is worth at least some commendation over your plain old prison food. Here is a list of what some of these final meals look like. The time is now 5 p.m., and witnesses of the sentencing should start arriving at the prison. This may consist of the family of the victims, journalists, or even family of the condemned. They will be told to try and stay quiet as they are ushered into the witness room. The time of execution can vary from state to state, but it is usually always in the early evening, between the hours of 6 and 8 p.m. At this point, the prisoner will be taken to the execution room to carry out the proceedings of his final hour. A warden that was interviewed, and had done 89 executions, claimed to have only encountered one inmate that proved difficult to deal with. However, in this case, the inmate had been protesting his innocence. But this was never proven to be true. The walk to the chamber is only about 10 feet in most places, and inmates never had to be forced by the guards. By that point, they would have already accepted their inevitable demise. A former Death Watch guard told Business Insider that inmates usually act very dignified. It is a very clean procedure and there's no hustling or confusion. However, it is not always this way, especially if the prisoner is protesting his innocence. Inmates often notice the gurney first, since it is the place they would be put to death by lethal injection. At this time, the prisoner is told to sit on the gurney, and is then laid down. There will be several persons responsible for securing each part of his body. Medical practitioners are usually not present at the execution, since administering a lethal drug is not in line with their code of ethics. Instead, there will be a special team assigned by the prison to administer the injection. But this isn't always an easy process, since the veins tend to hide if the body is under stress. There is now a scheduled 15 minutes, under which the execution may be called off. This can be as a result of newfound evidence, or an unlikely change in the sentencing. But if that doesn't happen, the witnesses are brought into the main room and the curtains are drawn. Some inmates might make a final statement at this moment, but it really depends on their state of mind. Here are some examples of actual last words said by inmates. "Hey, it's a good day to die. Somebody needs to kill my trial attorney. I think that governor's phone is broke. He hasn't called yet." Certainly, these are some of the more unique parting words used by prisoners. However, most people will simply say their final farewell, or give an apology for the sins they have committed. At this point, the chaplain may lay a hand on the prisoner, then give a final nod to the executioner, thus signaling that it is now time. The end of the day. End of the road. The end of a life. Now that you have bared witness to the entire execution process, do you think criminals are deserving of such a sentence? What if you were wrongfully placed on death row, or knew someone who has been? Would you be able to handle the emotional and psychological trauma of these final 24 hours? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And until next time, Alizoid out.
There goes a sight from my soul. There goes a sight, there goes a sight. Now there goes a sight from my soul. There goes a sight from my soul. There goes a sight, there goes a sight. There goes a sight from my soul. I think a fall angel just walked by. 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 There goes a sight from my soul. There goes a sight, there goes a sight. Now there goes a sight from my. There goes a sight.